Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live chat. I'm Angela Walters and I'm super glad that you're joining me. Whether you're joining live right now or watching later, super glad to be talking about quilting. I go live every week at 3 p.m. on Thursday Central Time and talk about quilting. And right now we're talking about quilting feathers. So we're in the middle of a video series and I'm glad you are joining us. So got some stuff to recap from this video, but want to give you a couple updates. So as part of the Fabulous Feathers Free Motion Challenge, I've designed a custom panel and some of you have purchased that. Good news, everybody that is still waiting on your panels, they are going to be here Friday. So they'll be here Friday. My fabric elves and I will be getting them packaged and ready to go out on Saturday. Fingers crossed, and so you should have them very soon. So thank you for your patience, those of you that might not have got it, and it's not too late to get your panel if you want to quilt along with me. Of course, you don't have to have it to participate in the Free Motion Challenge. All you have to have is your sewing machine, free motion foot, and some fabric to quilt on. So don't feel like you have to have it. Next week, we're gonna actually start the originally scheduled challenge. So if you remember, it was supposed to start this week and I went ahead and bumped it back a week just to give us a little time to make sure everybody gets their panel. So this week I had just a kind of a bonus video. It was troubleshooting common feather frustrations. And so that's what we're going to recap in today's live chat. So we'll be talking about that. So if you logged on and were kind of confused, like, pretty sure it wasn't supposed to start, this is kind of a primer. We'll talk about why I chose that and why it's good to know those common frustrations. I do want to just mention, I do want to point out that I know that the challenge starts next week, which is Thanksgiving week, and this is a very busy time of year for everybody, and I totally understand that. I'll just say the videos will always be on my YouTube channel, so if it's not a great time, if life gets in the way, no worries, you can come back and do it at your leisure, at your convenience. But there's just something about carving out a little bit of time for yourself, if possible, to enjoy your hobby. So I'll encourage you that if it is possible, carve that time out and practice and quilt along with us because it'll be a great option. That way you can ask the questions live during our live chat. Speaking of questions, I have Jessica over here and she is writing them down as you're typing them. So if you're watching live, type them out and she'll give them to me at the end. As we start getting into all the things I want to teach you, there's going to be questions that arise, and that's why I've started doing the live chats so you can ask me and I can help you out. So please take advantage of that. Okay, before I get to the slideshow and talk about the quilting designs, let's talk a little bit about this challenge and how it relates to a previous challenge I've done. So I think this is my 10th free motion challenge quilting along, and the second one I ever did was on feathers as well. And so that's been a few years ago, and it's a great resource. So if you have time this week, you want to go back and watch those videos, that's going to be great. We're not going to be covering the same exact content in this challenge. So we're going to be talking about slightly different things, but building off of those same feathers that we learned there. So if you took that previous challenge, no worries, this is still going to be some new information. And if you didn't, no worries, you'll still be able to do it. So I encourage you to check that out. That's on my YouTube channel, and so you can find it in my previous videos. And be sure to subscribe while you're there because you'll get notifications when I go live and when new videos come out. Okay, how to participate in the Free Motion Challenge. How do we do this? So basically, for the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be releasing a video tutorial, and that's going to come out on Tuesday around approximately 11 a.m. Central. So sometimes that will change. That will not be live. You'll watch that and it will be an edited, quicker tutorial where I show you how to do that week's challenge or, assignment or whatever you want to call it. And then I go live on Thursdays, and that's where I'm talking live. So you can participate in the challenge by watching the video and ask live. So very, very good. But not on Thanksgiving. That's right. Yeah, because that is Thursday. I'm going to move that to next week. Yeah, check my schedule. I forgot next week's already Thanksgiving. Yeah. Thank you, Jessica, for reminding me that. Anyway, all right, so let's talk about a recap of what we saw. So if you did check out this week's challenge video, the little bonus video, it was common feather frustration. So let's go into that and see what we're going to be talking about. All right, wrong picture. This is the right one. All right, so when it comes to quilting feathers, I know that sometimes we can follow all the rules and they still don't look, I'll say, quite right, or how we think they should look. And that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with them. It just means that if you want them to look slightly different, here are some common things that you can fix. And one of the things I miss about traveling and teaching people in person is being able to help them identify those common frustrations. But we're going to go over the most common ones. That's one benefit of having taught quilting classes in person so long, as I know a lot of the questions or a lot of the common frustrations. So let's kind of work through those. Now, what I want to point out is just because I say that's not quite right, that doesn't mean you can't quilt your feather that way. Ultimately, as long as you like how it looks, that's all that matters. There's no one perfect way to quilt feathers, so don't feel like it's something that you have to keep striving for if you like the way that it looks. So the video starts off where I show you the two different kinds of feathers. Now there are tons of feather variations, tons of different ways to quilt them. And so I kind of just narrowed it down to two types. So basically, all feathers have, for the most part, a spine, some don't, and then petals, these big round things on the sides. And there's really a couple ways you can go about quilting it, but I show you two different ways. One is the basic feather, and this is this one right here, where I'm adding those petals, but there's no traveling, there's no backtracking. Usually, for most quilters, this is the place to begin because it's a little bit easier to quilt it. It's also nice when you need something a little faster. You want something that looks elegant, but you want it to be kind of quick. So that's going to be the more basic feather. Now, I think I said this in the video, but one thing I do want to reiterate is when I demonstrate this feather, I always go to the top of my spine and work my way down, adding those petals. You don't have to quilt it that way. Obviously, you can go from the bottom up. You can do it in any kind of, configuration that you want. So I'm only the expert of my opinion. Don't feel like you have to do it exactly like I do it. You can definitely find your own style. But the basic feather is nice, again, if you want just a nice feather, but you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on it. This might be something I use in busier fabrics or blocks that aren't maybe necessarily the highlight of the quilt. And so it's just kind of a nice basic feather. And I hate to say basic because it sounds like such a mean thing, like, oh, that's so basic. I mean that it's pretty simple in how it goes together. Now, knowing how it goes together and actually achieving it, two different things, but seeing it go together is fairly basic. Then we have what I call the custom feather. This is definitely, none of these feathers are original to me, but sometimes you might hear this called the bump hump feather, which I'm sorry, I just can't say that in a video tutorial without laughing, so that's why I call it the custom feather. It does incorporate a little bit of traveling on the sides, and it works from the bottom up, so they kind of stack on top of each other. So the way the two go together is slightly different. This is definitely more elegant, I think, again, just my opinion, more elegant, a little bit more difficult because we're trying to quilt directly on those lines or as close as we can, and really can take up some space really fast. So once you get the hang of this design, it really doesn't take too long, and especially if you quilt it nice and large, it takes up a lot of space. So definitely one I like to use. So I kind of broke down the diagram for this feather. In the video, there's links to free downloadable quilting diagrams and tip sheet, and I want to encourage you to take advantage of that. I spend a lot of time putting those together, so I want you to have that as a resource. The only thing I ask is if you download it, give the video a thumbs up or subscribe or something that helps me out. But this kind of shows you how I like to quilt the custom feather. These petals go out in groups of two, so like one goes out, and you backtrack, and you come back in, and they kind of work that way. In the video, I talk a little bit about how I change it up, and we'll see here in a second why I quilt with the echoed spine. But again, there's a lot of different ways that you can quilt this feather, a lot of different variations that you can make from the two of them. Now, we're going to be talking about variations next week, or next video, and then great question came through on the type chat before I went live. Will I be showing a particular kind of variation? And this particular one has like a little thing in the center. No, but I think it might be fun. I'll do a how to create your own variation kind of stuff. So we're gonna learn some different types of feathers, but for the most part, most feathers can fall into one of these two categories. So regardless of which one you like, you're gonna be able to get a lot of versatility out of it. Okay, let's talk about common trouble, common frustrations. Okay, so this is where we can really start to diagnose issues and make them look the way you want them to look. Number one, most common of all time, I think, when I've taught issue is forgetting to make that petal look like it's merging into the spine. Now, if you're not sure I'm talking about, go back and watch that video tutorial because I'm referencing everything I said in there. But if you look at this feather, if you look on the bottom left side, those petals kind of come in, they're merging into the spine. That's the best word I can think of. It's like they're gonna become the spine. I also think of it like an on-ramp, like you're getting on the highway, right? So it's gonna go aim down there. This does a couple things. When I'm quilting this basic feather, quilting that line so it comes back in, almost like that half heart shape, is gonna leave me room for my next petal and make it obvious what goes there. And while not as technical, and I don't have a lot of evidence to back this up, I just think it looks better. I think it draws your eye down. It just kind of adds to that pretty elegant look. So if you see on the right side, those petals are quilted so that they're intersecting the spine. They're going to cross over. Technically not incorrect. It just doesn't look quite as good, in my opinion, in my humble opinion. So if you're quilting them and you're like, oh, it's not looking quite right, be sure that you're merging it into that spine. Now, that can be tricky as we get into spines that are moving around in a lot of different directions, but it doesn't matter where that middle line is going. We're going to just keep going until we merge into it. Now, of course, I'm not going to point out mistakes and not show you how to fix it. So how do you fix that issue? Well, one, you either acknowledge it as your new feather variation and just own it, or if you catch it in time, if you've quilted into that merge line, just travel down the spine a bit and then start again. And you can kind of see where I did that on the upper left side on that second petal down where it merges in. As an example, it should have came down. So I'm just going to travel down and then start over. And again, in that video, I show you how to do that. Don't get hung up on those little bitty things, right? Because when you're done and you step back, you're just going to see that whole overall design. And I say this with so much love and kindness. You never get better at quilting by ripping out your quilting. Now, I know that there's some perfectionists out there that are like, no, I have to have it look right. But as long as you can move on and get on the right track, it's going to be fine. So try not to obsess too much about that. And so I want to show you some examples of that kind of curvy spine. So here we're going to be seeing this in the motif section, but look how that spine really curves over. Well, that means that those petals on the underside, on the inner side of that curve, I have to go quite a while before I run into that spine, and that's fine. I'm just going to sustain that curve until I run into the spine and merge it in there. So depending on whether that spine is moving towards you or away from you, you'll have to go shorter or longer until you run into it. Again, that's what makes it look so pretty. So look ahead of the needle and just trust your hands to move you there. And let's say it doesn't look great, no problem. There's a lot more petals to add. I'm sure that they're going to look fine when it's all done. So again, merging it into the spine, very, very important. Another one, and I should say this one is also subjective. There's no evidence here to back this up. But I think that petals or feathers look better when you quilt that petal nice and round. And I know for sure in my live classes or when I would be teaching, people are quilting really small because they're afraid I'm going to see it when I get over to them, so then they can cover it up when I get over there. I would always joke, I can see it before you even know I'm coming, so don't worry about it. But there is something to be said for when you learn a new design, some quilters find it scary to really extend that design out there, really get that motion out there. But it's going to look so much prettier, again, in my opinion, because that unquilted area in those petals will pop out and it will look just beautiful. So if you're struggling with this, no worries, and if you love the way it looks, no worries, but you definitely will look better if you extend it out. So even marking out a couple of those petals beforehand will really help you if that's what you want. And just know that it will make it take up more room and go faster. So ultimately it's more efficient too. So if you like the look of the other petals, make them bigger. All right, another one, this is very, very common, and we're going to talk about backtracking and thread buildup here. So the thing about this custom feather is we're incorporating traveling, and so that's where we're quilting along a previously quilted line. And isn't that the funniest joke of all, right? Like here, I'm going to quilt this, and now I got to quilt it again. So the thing is with this, using a matching thread color is huge. I'm using a red thread on light gray fabric. I would never probably do this in real life, but I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. That would be helpful, right? So first of all, if I had used a matching thread color for this, you would still have that beautiful unquilted area coming to your attention and you wouldn't notice the thread buildup. But the way our brains work is we're attracted to novelty. Anytime there's a difference, whether it's denser quilting, it's something like that, it's just going to draw our eyes to it, and so it can be distracting to the feather. So here you can see in the center a lot of backtracking, and you can also see that sometimes it doesn't quite land on that spine the way I want it to. I had extra couple glasses of wine, so it was a little bit sloppier. So how do you fix that? Well, here's the thing. In real life, there's going to be mistakes. There's no such thing as perfection in free motion quilting. You know that. So if I'm faced with making a mistake, I'm just going to ask myself, which mistake is more noticeable? If I'm going to make a mistake, which one is going to be the better of the two? So, for instance, if I'm having trouble hitting that spine all the time, and I'm always crossing over, I would rather stop short than cross over, because then I won't have that thread buildup. And if you do it all the time, it's going to look intentional. So here is the basic feather, and I'm quilting my petals so that I stop from that spine about 1/4 of an inch. So that's taking care of that, right? I don't have any of that backtracking. I don't have any of that thread buildup. And since it's all of them, who's to say that's not the way it's supposed to be? I will say, though, that as I'm coming around, I'm still quilting it as though it would merge into that spine. I'm just stopping a little bit short. And so you can use the foot of your machine as a guide. Once your foot hits that line, you can go ahead and just change direction. So that it's a little bit quicker, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think it looks beautiful. Just whatever you do, do it consistently, and that's what will make it look beautiful. Another thing that I do is I like to have an echoed spine. So here on this particular feather, you can see I have that gap in between the spine and the petals. But I do like to echo my spine because I love the separation that it gives the two sides. That way, if there is a little bit of overlap, if I do happen to travel and cross over that spine, at least the two sides are separated, and it might help prevent multiple thread buildup there. Again, I just like the way it looks, so I always quilt my feathers with a spine. There are some drawbacks to that, and if you're newer to quilting, you're like, okay, you can just ignore this part. But the one big drawback is, since I have an echoed spine, I have to quilt up one whole side, come back, and then do the other. So there's no like switching back and forth. But again, I just love how it looks, and I just, I love how it goes. So that idea of spacing it out will work whether you're doing the basic feather or the more custom feather. It's both going to be fine. All right, so this was the last one, and I didn't actually include it as a troubleshooting. It was just a personal preference and just something that I think. Again, I know I'm saying this way too much, but I just want you to know, like, there's no wrong way to do this. If you love it, then go for it. But this last one, it's pretty, it's beautiful. It has everything correct, right? I have my half heart shape. They're merging into that spine. It's echoed. There's no thread buildup, but that spine is nice and straight. It's like stick straight. And sometimes I might want that, but in general, I like when a feather has a little bit more of a curvy spine. I think it just looks a little bit more fluid. I just like it that way, and that just might be because that's how I quilt it. Another thing it does is it kind of moves your eye so that it's not quite as easy to see, hey, here's where all the lines come together. So it's a little bit of help deceive any mistakes there. Don't make your spine so curvy, though, because the curvier it is, the harder it is, of course, to make it merge into that line. I just want to add a nice gentle wave. Now, we're going to see next week that that's totally different, because we're going to be using this feather to fill in a block, and some of them will use a seam. And so in that instance, when I'm using a seam or a part of the block as my spine, then it's going to be straight. But if I'm quilting these out in space or filling in an area, I like to go ahead and give it more of a wavy spine. Again, it's up to you. You might like that more straight, totally fine. So if you've quilted feathers and you're like, it just doesn't look quite right, then you might find that helpful. Let's talk about practicing. So at the very end, I threw in a little like, okay, if you want to practice, I know that like when you're learning something new, it can be super scary. And when I started quilting, I just could not get the feathers down. I just couldn't do it. And that was before YouTube, so I couldn't watch any tutorials. And I finally had to like just invest in a stencil. This isn't the stencil I bought, but I just found a stencil and I marked it and I quilted it and I quilted it over it and just kept repeating until it clicked. And then I got to where I didn't have to mark out both sides, just one side of the feather. And then I got to where I would just mark out the spine, and then now I feel pretty confident in quilting it. So practicing is going to really help you. So if you're quilting along your feathers and you're like, this is never going to work, it just takes a little bit of practice, I promise. And so this is the little sample from that stencil. Find a stencil you like, and this applies to any design because it will give you a roadmap to follow. It'll give you a line to follow so that you're not thinking about where to go next. You can just kind of get the hang of that design. Also, drawing out the designs will help. I know I say that a lot, but I know some of you don't quite believe me. When you're drawing out your designs, whether on a piece of paper or on your fabric, you're not learning how to draw the design, you're learning where to go next. What's the next step? What's the path of this design? So just take that for what it is. And then once you get the hang of it, then you can make those feathers as big and as ornate as you like, whether you make those petals really large or just a little bit smaller. It's going to be a lot of fun and beautiful on your quilts. So let me encourage you that it all comes down to those basic steps that we saw at the very beginning. This feather is quilted no different than the other one that we saw in the beginning. It just has a little bit more of pizzazz in the center. So be encouraged. You can definitely get there. Now, next week's video tutorial, we're going to learn how to quilt feathers and feather variations in blocks, and I'm so excited about this. This is something that wasn't in that last video series, how do we make the feather fit a defined area? And what's fun about this, it might sound counterintuitive, but some quilters find it easier to quilt a feather within a defined space because you have that boundary that you know that you have to fill in. And there's also a clear start and finish, and then you get to see what it looks like when it fills that. So we'll talk about different variations and different ways to quilt your spines. I'm so excited, and then we'll actually get to quilting on our panel, so it's going to be a great time. And then there's a picture of the stencil out of order, so you can see what the stencil looks like there. And then just a little teaser to the week after, we're going to be talking about the feather meander. So the feather meander is a design that takes the basic shape of a feather and creates an all-over design. And then I'm going to like touch base on thread painting. So I'm excited. I've not really done that in a challenge, and we're just going to throw a little bit out there and see how it lands. And if you love it, we might have to do a full challenge on that in the future. So keep your eyes open for that. So hopefully this has given you a little bit of ideas or suggestions on how to improve your feathers. And again, ultimately they're going to look great no matter what. So there was a couple questions that came through on the type chat before. I get on YouTube about a half an hour before I go live, and I answer questions, and so definitely join us if you're available. A lot of questions today about SID. Everyone wants to know about SID. Well, what is SID? Stitching in the ditch. So if you see SID, that's stitching in the seams. A lot of questions, should I do it before I start? Should I do it as I'm going? Do I have to do it? What is it? So stitching in the ditch is just stitching along the seams to, first, it could stabilize your quilt for you, or also just to kind of give you a boundary to fill in. On the panel, I kind of demonstrated how I would progress on a long arm. For this challenge specifically, I would stitch along the seams so I can move back and forth. But you don't have to stitch in the ditch. It's a personal preference, 100%. So if you like the idea of stitching in the ditch, do it. If you don't like the idea, don't do it. If you're not sure, do half the quilt, right? It doesn't have to be quite a overwhelming thing. If you want to stitch in that seam, like on the panel, we have our fake seams. You can try to get it as close as you can on the line, right? But again, let's be honest, this is real life. And in real life, the dishes don't wash themselves, and our stitch in the ditch is not always going to be perfect. So if I have to cheat to one side or the other, I'm definitely going to cheat to the side that's less noticeable. So if I'm stitching along the seams, the fake seams of my panel, and I'm on the blue and then the yellow area, and I have yellow thread, I'm going to kind of cheat it over to the yellow side. That way, if it does go over, it'll be fine. But the question came up, well, what do I do on like a actual quilt when I have a seam and it's pressed, and how do I handle that? Well, for the most part, I try to still stitch it right down the center. But usually if it's pressed to one side, I'll have a high or a low, and then that'll give you a ditch, and I just try to fall in the ditch as much as I can. But you know what? Like, when you're done and you step back, you're not going to see it anyway. So don't let that overwhelm you. If you're a newer machine quilter and you're like, oh, now I have to worry about that, don't worry about it. The more you do it, the more you'll find what you like and what your opinions are. So short answer, you can do it if you want. You can leave it out if you don't want to. If you're like, no, I want a rule to follow, then stitch around the blocks in the panel and then leave it at that, and then we'll add some more as we go. So we have any questions, Jessica? Good, good, good. All right. Tell us about the color of threads I'm using in this challenge. Do you have all day? I love talking about thread colors. No, I picked 5 coordinating thread colors that go with the panel. So it's a light gray, which is going to be our neutral. It's going to go over the backgrounds, it blends in. And then 4 colors that kind of have that pop of color. So there's like orange yellow, there's a beautiful pink lemonade, which is just like luscious, mint, which is perfect green, and then haze, which is like a purplish blue. But ultimately, if you have other threads hanging around, it's totally fine. I just like to pick some that match with that, but it's up to you. Oh, this is so common. So this person's scared and anxious to start their panel on the long arm. Is it best to base the quilt panel and then do the quilting? So it's totally up to you. The thing about working on a long arm is the way we approach the quilt is totally different than on a sewing machine. On a sewing machine, you can start anywhere you want. On a long arm, we're thinking very, in a line and kind of working our way down. So if you're going to want to move back and forth, go ahead and stabilize your quilt and stitch in those seams and add any pins that you need to so that you can free up and just quilt when we get started. There has been some other comments, especially before we went live, that was like, oh, this panel is so pretty. I don't want to ruin it. Should I practice? And I know I talked about this last week. You should do whatever you will do. So if you will only quilt on fat quarters, then get some fat quarters. But I did design the panel this perfect size to practice on. And what's fun about practicing on a piece like this is when you're done, First, I promise you'll be like proud of yourself because you finished it, and you'll see where you started and where you finished, and you'll see improvement. And I think it's a really want to encourage you to either get a bigger piece of yard fabric or a panel and quilt on that. However, it is pretty. I don't want to design ugly panels, so if you're worried about quilting on it, get some practice fabric. Ultimately, whatever you will do, I don't want to, make you scared to even start, right? All right, can I explain how to start and stop so we don't have to bury threads? Great question. I think this has come up before. I'll definitely include that in either the next week's tutorial or the next time I go live with a chat. I'll make a quick little video. Basically, the short answer is I like to pull the bobbin thread up to the top and take a few stitches in place. I don't ever bury my threads because it takes too long, and that's a perfectly good reason not to do anything in my mind. But I know some people want to take the time to do that. You can do that. I'll just talk about all that in a future live chat. That way you can have a little video compilation. But okay, what is the name of the previous challenge you used feathers in? It's called, I think it's called Feathers Free Motion Challenge. So if you go to FMQ, like Free Motion Quilter, challenge.com, so FMQchallenge.com, you can find all my previous challenges, and you can find a link to that. I used a panel I had designed a long time ago for a fabric company, and so there's no more panels for it, but you can definitely get those downloadable diagrams. I think I started doing it about that time, and get some help with that. Can I give any tips on what to do when the spine curves in? You struggle with that. So like when it's coming towards you, right? You just run into it and then move on. I think sometimes like maybe we overthink it, but as the spine's coming towards you, it's actually easier because you don't have to go quite as far. It's when it's going away from you that's a little bit more trouble. So still come around your curve and aim down, and then kind of as you're coming and you hit that spine, perfect, you're ready to travel back up and begin again. And I don't know why I feel the need to do the hand motions. I feel like they help, but ultimately I talk with my hands. So there you go. I hope that helps. If it doesn't, I'll be sure to include it in a future tutorial. On a side note, not that you asked, but when I'm putting together the videos for the challenge, I do film some ahead of time, but I don't film and edit and finish them all up before I even start because of stuff like this. Questions that come up that I didn't think to answer, and so I can incorporate them in some of the videos. On an unmarked space, about how big do you make your petals in length, or does it depend? Oh, somebody's been reading or listening to the live chat. I always say it depends. It depends. I love it. Even my long arm owners here in Kansas City, even my employees, they'll be like, oh shit, it depends. Okay. In general, I make them a couple inches. So I go out, if I'm just quilting it for fun, right? I'll quilt it out 2 inches is usually about good. I would say try to find a length or a width that you can do without moving your hands. So depending on your comfort level or the machine, maybe it's just about 1.5 inches. You want to be able to do it in one movement so you don't have to reposition mid-feather. And I always tell people, don't point out your mistakes, so I don't do it. But in that sample of all the feathers I had, there's a couple where I had to reposition my hands in mid-feather, and it didn't look great. But so if you can do it in one movement, that's more important. So try that out. Where can you buy the stencil? So I have a link, or if you go to my website, I'll put a link in the description box below too. Basically the landing page with all that, there's all the stencils that we have, feather stencils, and you can check that out. And what I love about these stencils, they're called full line stencils, so they're bendy, they're like screen printed, and when you use your pounce pad, it just marks this. So I had a bunch of plastic stencils, but they're kind of harder to display and they get bent, and so I really like the full line stencils. And we sell a bunch of different kinds, not just the feathers. I mean, they have some really good ones out there too. But you're going to use the pounce pad to mark those. Don't try to use your marking pen because it probably won't quite work. So anyway, everyone, I hope you enjoyed this live chat. I hope you'll leave a comment if you have any questions. I love to get on from time to time and make sure everybody's doing fine. And if you like the video, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up. And next week, we'll be releasing the video with feathers and blocks and start quilting on our panel. I cannot wait. So I will see you very, very soon. Happy quilting, everybody.